Chapter 1. The Seeds of War. Please press the like button. It helps more people hear these important stories. The world was tired of war. After the Great War, people believed they had seen the worst. Soldiers returned home broken. Cities had been destroyed. Millions of families mourned their loved ones. Never again, they said. Leaders signed treaties to promise peace. But not everyone agreed. Germany was angry. The Treaty of Versailles blamed them for the war. They had to pay enormous fines. They lost land and pride. Factories closed. People lost jobs. Families went hungry. Many Germans felt humiliated. They wanted to rise again, to show the world they were strong. In Japan, there was another kind of anger. The country was growing, but it had few resources. They needed oil, coal, and land. They looked to their neighbors, China, Korea, and the Pacific Islands. These lands should be ours, some leaders said. Japan started building an army. They dreamed of becoming a great empire. Italy was restless too. After the Great War, they didn't get the rewards they expected. Their leader, Benito Mussolini, spoke of a glorious past. He promised to make Italy powerful again. He created armies and made bold speeches. Crowds cheered. People believed him. In the middle of this storm stood a man named Adolf Hitler. He was a soldier in the Great War. He hated the Treaty of Versailles. In his speeches, he blamed others for Germany's problems. He pointed at Jews, communists, and other groups. "They are the reason for our suffering," he shouted. Many Germans listened. Hitler promised jobs. He promised food. He promised hope. Hitler became the leader of Germany in 1933. He called himself the Führer. Under his rule, Germany changed quickly. Factories opened, roads and bridges were built. People went back to work. But there was a price. The Nazis controlled everything. They arrested anyone who spoke against them. Books were burned. Neighbors spied on each other. Fear grew. In secret, Hitler started building weapons. He trained soldiers. He wanted to make Germany a military superpower again. The world watched nervously, but few acted. Memories of the Great War were still fresh. No one wanted another conflict. Leaders hoped Hitler would stop, but he didn't. By 1936, Hitler made his first move. He sent troops into the Rhineland, a region Germany had lost after the Great War. It was against the Treaty of Versailles, but no one stopped him. Maybe he will be satisfied now, some thought. But Hitler wasn't satisfied. Around the same time, Italy and Japan were also taking action. Mussolini's army invaded Ethiopia, an African nation. The Ethiopian people fought bravely, but they had little chance against Italy's modern weapons. The League of Nations, an international peace organization, condemned Italy. But their words were weak. Mussolini ignored them. Japan invaded China in 1937. Cities like Nanjing fell under Japanese control. The world was shocked by reports of violence. Thousands of civilians were killed. Still, the international community hesitated. Who would stop Japan? The U.S. stayed out of it. Europe was too far away. Japan kept advancing. Back in Europe, Hitler found a partner in Mussolini. They signed an agreement. Together, they would build a new world order. Later, Japan joined them. They called themselves the Axis powers. Their ambitions grew larger. Their plans became darker. In 1938, Hitler turned his attention to Austria. He wanted to unite all German-speaking people under one flag. Without firing a shot, German troops marched into Austria. Many Austrians welcomed them. The world stayed silent. Next, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region in Czechoslovakia. It belongs to Germany, he claimed. European leaders held a meeting in Munich to avoid war. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, believed they could reason with Hitler. They gave him the Sudetenland, hoping it would satisfy him. Chamberlain returned to Britain and declared, "Peace for our time." But it was not peace. In the background, Hitler made secret plans. He wanted more than the Sudetenland. He wanted all of Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, German tanks rolled in. The world began to realize Hitler wouldn't stop. Fear spread across Europe. Britain and France started preparing for war. They promised to protect Poland, Hitler's likely next target. But Hitler was ahead of them. In August 1939, he made a shocking deal with the Soviet Union. Hitler and Stalin, two fierce enemies, agreed not to fight each other. They even divided Poland between them. The deal stunned the world. On September 1st, 1939, the storm finally broke. German planes roared over Poland. Bombs fell on cities. Tanks smashed through defenses. Soldiers advanced quickly, using a new tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Poland fought back. But they were no match for Germany's strength. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. The mistakes of the past were repeating themselves, but this time the stakes were even higher. The seeds of war had grown into a deadly storm. But the world had not yet seen the full scale of what was coming. Millions would soon be caught in a struggle that would test their courage, resilience, and humanity. Chapter 2. A Spark in Poland. The morning of September 1st, 1939, was calm. People in Poland went about their lives. Farmers worked in their fields. Children played in the streets. But just after sunrise, everything changed. The air filled with a low rumble. It grew louder and louder. German planes flew overhead. Their engines roared like thunder. Then came the first explosions. Bombs dropped on cities, railways, and bridges. Flames lit up the sky. People ran for safety, their faces filled with fear. The German army moved quickly. Tanks rolled across the fields. Soldiers marched behind them. They had a plan, a new way of fighting called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The idea was to strike fast and hard, leaving no time to react. Polish soldiers tried to stop them, but the Germans were too strong. Their tanks crushed everything in their path. In the capital, Warsaw, people prepared to defend their city. The Polish army fought bravely. Young men, old men, even women joined the effort. They built barricades and carried supplies. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets. But the Germans were relentless. Day by day, the city crumbled. Polish families huddled together in basements. Mothers held their children close, trying to calm their cries. "It will be over soon," they whispered, though they weren't sure if it was true. Food became scarce. Water supplies were cut off. Each day felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, in Germany, Adolf Hitler watched with satisfaction. His plan was working. Poland was falling quickly. He believed no one could stop him. But across the English Channel, Britain was watching closely. So was France. They had promised to protect Poland. Now, they had to act. On September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Crowds gathered in the streets to hear the news. In Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain spoke on the radio. His voice was heavy. "This country is at war with Germany," he said. The people listened in silence. They knew what it meant. More battles, more loss, more pain. But even with Britain and France stepping in, Poland was alone for now. German forces were too strong, and help was too far away. The Polish army fought with courage, but their weapons were old. Many soldiers were on horseback, while the Germans had tanks and planes. The fight seemed hopeless. By mid-September, the situation grew worse. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. This was part of a secret deal between Hitler and Stalin. The two powerful leaders had agreed to divide Poland between them. The Polish people were caught in the middle. Warsaw continued to resist. The people refused to give up, even as bombs destroyed their homes. In one corner of the city, a small group of soldiers held a key position. They fought without rest. Supplies ran low, but they did not surrender. Their bravery inspired others. For a moment, hope flickered. But on September 27th, Warsaw fell. The city was in ruins. Smoke filled the air. Streets were covered in rubble. The Polish government fled, seeking safety in exile. The German and Soviet armies divided the country, just as they had planned. For the people of Poland, the nightmare had only begun. News of Poland's fall spread quickly. In Britain and France, people were shocked. They had hoped their declarations of war would stop Hitler. But now they saw his true strength. The world began to understand. This was not a small conflict. This was the start of something much bigger. Across Europe, fear grew. Families prepared for the worst. They stocked food and water. Children were sent to the countryside. Everyone wondered, where will Hitler strike next? In Germany, Hitler was confident. He believed his army was unstoppable. His generals praised him. They said the plan had worked perfectly, but not everyone was celebrating. Some Germans worried about what would happen next. They feared the war would grow out of control. In Britain, Winston Churchill was among those preparing for the future. At this time, he was not yet Prime Minister, but his voice was strong. He warned his country, "This is only the beginning. We must be ready for a long fight." In Poland, the resistance did not end with Warsaw's fall. Small groups of fighters went underground. They formed secret networks, hiding in forests and mountains. They sabotaged German trains and attacked supply lines. They risked everything to fight back. Their courage became a symbol of hope. The fall of Poland was a turning point. The world had seen Hitler's power, but they had also seen the bravery of ordinary people. Soldiers, civilians, and families had faced unimaginable terror, and they had not given up. The spark in Poland had ignited a fire that would soon engulf the entire world. But who would stand up to stop it? And how much would they have to sacrifice? The answers were not yet clear. For now, the people of Europe braced themselves. The worst was still to come. Chapter 3. The Blitzkrieg Strikes. The year was 1940. Europe was on edge. After the invasion of Poland, people wondered where Hitler would strike next. No one was safe. Then, in April, German forces attacked Denmark. It happened so quickly it was like a flash of lightning. Planes roared across the sky. Troops crossed the borders. The Danish army tried to fight, but it was no use. In just one day, Denmark surrendered. The people of Denmark were shocked. Many had hoped that Hitler would leave their small country alone. But now they saw the truth. He would stop at nothing. Next, the Germans turned their attention to Norway. The attack began on April 9th, 1940. German warships entered Norwegian ports. Soldiers landed along the coast. Planes bombed key cities. The Norwegian army resisted bravely. They fought in the mountains, using the terrain to their advantage. But Germany's weapons were too strong. After 2 months of fighting, Norway fell. The victories in Denmark and Norway gave Germany control of the north. Hitler now had access to important ports and resources. He was ready for his next target, France. In May 1940, German tanks rolled into Belgium and the Netherlands. These countries were neutral. They didn't want to fight, but Hitler didn't care. His armies pushed through their borders with incredible speed. The world saw the true power of Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was a new kind of fighting. It was fast and deadly. First, German planes attacked from above. They destroyed enemy defenses and caused chaos. Then, tanks and troops moved in, striking hard and fast. It was like a storm, sudden, powerful, and impossible to stop. In Belgium, people fled their homes. Entire families packed their belongings and ran. Roads were crowded with carts, bicycles, and cars. Children cried as bombs fell around them. "Where can we go?" they asked. No one had an answer. By mid-May, the Germans reached France. French and British troops were waiting. They had built strong defenses along the Maginot Line, a series of forts and bunkers. But the Germans didn't attack there. Instead, they went around it. They moved through the Ardennes, a forest that the French thought was impossible to cross. The German tanks surprised everyone. They broke through the French lines and advanced quickly. Cities fell one by one. French soldiers fought with everything they had. So did the British forces who had come to help. But they were overwhelmed. In Paris, the mood was tense. People listened to the radio for news. They prayed that their army would stop the Germans. But the news grew worse each day. The enemy was getting closer. On June 10th, the French government left Paris. Officials packed their papers and fled south. The city was left defenseless. 4 days later, German soldiers marched into Paris. The once busy streets were silent. The Eiffel Tower stood tall, but the city felt broken. For many French people, it was the darkest day of their lives. They watched as the German flag was raised. Some cried. Others whispered, "What will happen to us now?" Meanwhile, on the beaches of Dunkirk, a miracle was happening. Thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped. The German army had surrounded them. There was no way out. But Britain refused to give up. They launched Operation Dynamo, a daring rescue mission. Hundreds of boats crossed the English Channel to save the soldiers. Fishing boats, ferries, and even small sailboats joined the effort. The sea was rough, and German planes attacked from above. But the boats kept coming. In 9 days, more than 300,000 soldiers were rescued. They called it the Dunkirk Spirit. It was a story of courage, hope, and survival. Even though France was falling, this moment gave people strength. By the end of June, France had surrendered. Hitler's victory seemed unstoppable. In just a few weeks, his armies had conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The world was stunned. But not everyone was ready to give up. In Britain, a new leader had risen, Winston Churchill. He was strong, determined, and full of energy. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared. "We shall never surrender." The world held its breath. Hitler now controlled most of Europe. His next target was clear, Britain. But the British people were ready to stand alone. The battle for survival was about to begin. Chapter 4. Britain stands alone. The summer of 1940 was a time of fear and courage. France had fallen. Across Europe, German troops marched through cities, but one country refused to surrender. Britain stood alone. Hitler had a plan. He wanted to invade Britain, but first he needed control of the skies. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, prepared for a massive attack. Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF, was all that stood in their way. In July, the skies over Britain came alive. German planes flew in, dropping bombs on ports, airfields, and factories. The RAF fought back fiercely. British pilots took to the air in their Spitfires and Hurricanes. They were outnumbered, but determined. The battles were intense. Planes raced through the sky. Guns fired. Smoke trailed behind falling aircraft. Each day, pilots risked their lives to defend their country. Some never returned. On the ground, people watched anxiously. They heard the roar of engines and saw planes in dogfights above their heads. "That's one of ours!" they cheered when a German plane went down. But the cost was high. Homes were destroyed. Lives were lost. By September, Hitler changed his plan. He couldn't defeat the RAF in the air. So, he decided to target the cities instead. He wanted to break the spirit of the British people. On September 7th, 1940, the Blitz began. The Luftwaffe bombed London. The attack came without warning. Explosions shook the ground. Fires lit up the night sky. Buildings collapsed. People screamed and ran for cover. Day after day, the bombs fell. Factories, homes, and schools were destroyed. Thousands of civilians died. Families were torn apart. Yet the British people didn't give up. Children were sent to the countryside for safety. Mothers hugged their sons and daughters tightly, not knowing when they would see them again. Trains carried the children away. Some waved goodbye with brave smiles. Others cried quietly. For many, it was the first time they were separated from their families. In London, people found ways to survive. They took shelter in underground train stations. Entire families slept on the cold, hard floors. They shared food and stories, trying to keep hope alive. Volunteers worked tirelessly. Firefighters battled the flames, even as bombs fell around them. Doctors and nurses cared for the injured. Neighbors helped each other rebuild. The spirit of unity was strong. In the mornings, people came out of shelters to see the damage. Streets were filled with rubble. Shops and houses were gone. But instead of despair, there was determination. "We can fix this," they said. And they did. Winston Churchill's voice became a symbol of hope. As Prime Minister, he gave powerful speeches. He told the British people to stand firm. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared. "We shall never surrender." His words inspired courage. The RAF pilots were hailed as heroes. They became known as the Few. Churchill praised them in another speech. "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." These words touched the hearts of a nation. But life during the Blitz was hard. Nights were sleepless. Families feared for their lives. Yet, even in the darkest times, there were moments of kindness and bravery. One night, a bomb hit a crowded shelter. Volunteers rushed to help. They dug through the rubble, pulling people to safety. Among them was a young boy, no older than 10, covered in dust but alive. He whispered, "Thank you." His words gave everyone strength to keep going. By the end of 1940, Hitler realized he could not break Britain. The RAF continued to fight. The British people stood strong. The invasion of Britain never happened. Hitler turned his attention elsewhere. For Britain, the Battle of Britain was a victory. But it came at a great cost. Thousands of lives were lost. Cities were destroyed. Yet, the country had shown the world its strength. They had proven that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they would not surrender. The year ended with hope. People celebrated Christmas in shelters and damaged homes. They lit candles and sang carols. The war was far from over, but they believed in a brighter future. Britain had stood alone, and they had survived. Chapter 5. Pearl Harbor, the Sleeping Giant Awakes. The morning of December 7th, 1941, was calm. The sun rose over the waters of Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. Sailors and soldiers started their day. Some wrote letters home. Others cleaned the decks of mighty ships. No one expected what was coming. Suddenly, the sound of engines filled the sky. Japanese planes appeared like shadows. At first, people thought it was a training exercise, but then bombs began to fall. The first explosions hit the ships. The USS Arizona was struck. A massive fireball erupted. The ship sank quickly, taking more than 1,000 men with it. The USS Oklahoma was hit next. It rolled onto its side, trapping sailors below deck. The sailors fought for their lives. Some jumped into the water even as it burned with oil. Others tried to free their friends from the sinking ships. The air was filled with smoke, screams, and chaos. Planes swooped low, machine guns firing. The Japanese pilots aimed for the battleships, the airfields, and anything that could fight back. American soldiers scrambled to defend themselves. They fired at the planes with rifles and small guns, but they were unprepared. In 2 hours, the attack was over. The damage was devastating. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Over 300 planes were ruined. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Rescue teams worked tirelessly. They pulled men from the water, soot-covered and coughing. Families across the U.S. waited for news, their hearts heavy with worry. For many, the news was not good. Back in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt heard the reports. He listened silently, his face grave. Then he spoke. This is a day that will live in infamy. The next day, December 8th, he stood before Congress. His voice was strong and steady. He asked for a declaration of war. Congress agreed. America was now part of the war. The sleeping giant had awoken. News of the attack spread quickly. Across America, people were shocked. Some were angry, others were afraid, but most of all, they were determined. Young men lined up at recruitment offices, ready to fight. Factories began producing weapons, tanks, and planes. The whole country united. For the Japanese, Pearl Harbor was a victory. They had struck a powerful blow against the U.S. Navy, but their leaders knew they had also awakened a fierce enemy. In the weeks that followed, Japan continued its attacks. They conquered the Philippines, Hong Kong, and other territories in the Pacific. Each victory made them bolder. But they had underestimated America's strength. The U.S. began planning their response. The Pacific Fleet was badly damaged, but it was not destroyed. Aircraft carriers, the most important ships, had been away from Pearl Harbor during the attack. They would become the backbone of the U.S. Navy. Life changed for everyone in America. Soldiers trained for battle. Women worked in factories, building the tools of war. Children collected scrap metal for weapons. People rationed food and gasoline. They knew the fight would be long and hard. Japanese Americans faced a different struggle. Many were sent to internment camps, accused of being spies. Families were forced to leave their homes. They lost businesses and belongings. It was a dark chapter in U.S. history. In April 1942, the U.S. launched a daring raid on Japan. 16 bombers, led by Colonel James Doolittle, took off from an aircraft carrier. They bombed Tokyo and other cities. The damage was small, but the message was clear. America would fight back. The raid lifted American spirits. It showed that Japan was not untouchable, but it also made the Japanese leaders more determined. They planned a new attack, one that would change the course of the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had brought the world into a new stage of war. Europe was already burning. Now, the Pacific was a battlefield too. The fight had become truly global. For America, Pearl Harbor was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. The nation had been attacked, and it would not rest until it had struck back. The sleeping giant was wide awake. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6, The Eastern Front, A Frozen Hell. In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler made a dangerous decision. He launched Operation Barbarossa, an invasion of the Soviet Union. His goal was simple: destroy the Soviet army and take its land. He thought it would be quick. He was wrong. On June 22, 1941, millions of German soldiers marched into Soviet territory. They were followed by tanks and planes. The attack was massive. Villages burned. Civilians ran for their lives. The Soviet army was caught by surprise. They lost thousands of soldiers in the first few days. But the Soviet Union was vast. Its land stretched endlessly, and its people were strong. They would not give up without a fight. The German army advanced quickly at first. They captured cities and farmland. People were forced to flee. Families left their homes, carrying only what they could. They walked for days through forests and across rivers, searching for safety. Hitler believed his army was unstoppable. But the Soviet winter was coming. In September 1941, the Germans surrounded Leningrad. The city was home to millions of people. Hitler ordered his troops to cut it off from the rest of the country. He wanted the people to starve. The siege of Leningrad began. Food ran out quickly. People ate whatever they could find: leaves, bark, and even their pets. Winter arrived, bringing freezing temperatures. The city was covered in snow. Buildings were destroyed by bombs. But the people of Leningrad refused to surrender. They built defenses with whatever they had. Workers made weapons in factories, even as bombs fell around them. Artists painted posters to lift spirits. Musicians played symphonies to inspire hope. Each day was a battle for survival. Families huddled together in small, cold rooms. Mothers gave their children the last crumbs of bread. Many did not survive. By the end of the siege, over 1 million people had died. But the city never fell. Meanwhile, battles raged across the Eastern Front. the Soviet army, led by Joseph Stalin, began to fight back. They destroyed bridges and railways to slow the Germans. They used the harsh winter to their advantage. German soldiers, not prepared for the cold, froze in their trenches. In December 1941, the Soviets launched a counterattack near Moscow. The German army, weakened by cold and hunger, was forced to retreat. Hitler was furious. His dream of a quick victory was over. In 1942, Hitler tried again. He sent his troops to the south toward the city of Stalingrad. This battle would become one of the deadliest in history. The German army bombed Stalingrad from the air. The city became a pile of rubble. But the Soviets used this destruction to their advantage. Soldiers fought street by street, building by building. The fighting was brutal. Winter returned, and the situation worsened for the Germans. Soviet troops surrounded the German army in Stalingrad. They cut off supplies. The German soldiers were trapped. They were cold, hungry, and desperate. In February 1943, the German army surrendered. It was a turning point in the war. Hitler's forces had suffered a massive defeat. The Eastern Front was a nightmare for both sides. Millions of soldiers and civilians died. Villages were burned. Cities were destroyed. The Soviet people endured incredible suffering. Yet, they showed remarkable strength. Farmers grew crops in secret. Teachers held classes in bombed-out schools. Soldiers fought with courage, even when all seemed lost. The war on the Eastern Front continued for years. The Soviets pushed the Germans back, step by step. In 1944, they began liberating the cities and villages that had been occupied. By 1945, the Red Army reached Berlin. The Eastern Front was the largest and bloodiest battlefield of World War II. It showed the power of human resilience. The people of the Soviet Union paid a heavy price, but they never gave up. The frozen lands of the East were scarred forever. But they were also a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who lived there. Chapter 7. Life in the Shadows. The war touched every corner of the world. Soldiers fought in jungles, deserts, mountains, and seas. But it was not just soldiers who suffered. Civilians faced the horrors of war every day. Bombs fell on their homes. Food was scarce. Families were torn apart. Yet, even in the darkest times, people found ways to resist and survive. In Europe, the resistance worked in secret. These were ordinary people, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, who risked everything to fight back against the enemy. They passed information to Allied forces. They destroyed enemy supply lines. They helped prisoners escape. In France, members of the resistance hid in forests and mountains. At night, they sabotaged German trains, cutting off supplies. They printed secret newspapers to keep people informed. If they were caught, they faced prison. Or worse. One of them was Marie, a young woman who lived in Paris. She worked in a bakery by day, serving bread to German soldiers. By night, she passed messages hidden inside loaves of bread to resistance members. It was dangerous work. If the soldiers had discovered her secret, she would have been arrested. But Marie knew she had to do her part. In other countries, people found their own ways to resist. In Poland, Jewish families hid from the Nazis in secret rooms and attics. Some lived in darkness for months or even years. Children were told to stay silent, no matter how scared they were. One such family was the Kowalskis. They hid in the basement of a farmer's house. The farmer brought them food at night, always careful not to be seen. The Kowalskis' youngest daughter, Anna, clutched a small doll her mother had made from scraps of fabric. She whispered to the doll, sharing her fears. One night, German soldiers searched the house. The family stayed completely still, holding their breath. Anna hugged her doll tightly, her heart pounding. The soldiers left without finding them. It was a close call, but they survived. In the Pacific, life was just as dangerous. Soldiers fought in thick jungles where every step could lead to danger. Civilians lived in fear of bombings and invasions. In the Philippines, a young boy named Mateo helped his family hide from Japanese soldiers. They lived in a cave deep in the jungle. Mateo gathered fruit and caught fish, always careful to avoid enemy patrols. One day, Japanese soldiers came close to the cave. Mateo's family stayed silent, not daring to move. The soldiers walked by without noticing them. Mateo's mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. In cities across the world, bombs fell from the sky. London was hit night after night during the Blitz. Families took shelter in underground train stations. They brought blankets, food, and whatever they could carry. In one shelter, a young boy named Tom played cards with his sister to pass the time. He tried to act brave, but his hands trembled every time he heard an explosion. His mother sang softly, trying to keep the children calm. When the bombing stopped, people emerged to see what was left of their streets. Buildings were reduced to rubble. Shops were gone. Yet, they helped each other rebuild, brick by brick. Even in the camps, where hope seemed lost, there were moments of courage. Prisoners shared scraps of food. They comforted each other with kind words. Some even planned escapes, risking their lives for a chance at freedom. One night, a group of prisoners in Germany worked together to dig a tunnel under the camp fence. It took weeks of careful planning. They dug in secret, hiding the dirt in their clothes. On a cold, moonless night, they crawled through the tunnel and escaped into the forest. Not all of them made it to safety, but their courage inspired others. It showed that even in the worst conditions, the human spirit could not be crushed. Women played a vital role in the war effort. In factories, they built planes, tanks, and weapons. They worked long hours, often while caring for children and elderly family members. Their hard work kept the war machines running. In the United States, Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of these women. Her image, with a red bandana and rolled-up sleeves, encouraged others to join the effort. "We can do it," was her slogan. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, both on the front lines and in hospitals. They treated soldiers and civilians, often under dangerous conditions. Supplies were limited, and many times they had to make do with what they had. In Italy, a nurse named Sophia cared for wounded soldiers in a makeshift hospital. The building had no electricity, and bombs fell nearby every night. Still, Sophia stayed at her post. She held the hands of soldiers, whispered comforting words, and saved as many lives as she could. The war brought out the worst and the best in humanity. There was cruelty and suffering, but there was also kindness and bravery. People helped each other, even when it meant risking their own lives. As the war went on, these small acts of courage added up. They showed that no matter how dark the world became, there was still light. War was everywhere. But so was hope. Chapter 8. Turning the Tide. By 1942, the world had been at war for 3 years. For a long time, it seemed the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy, would win. They had conquered large parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. But in 1942, things began to change. This was the year of hope. The Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, and others started fighting back. They won battles in the Pacific, North Africa, and the Soviet Union. Slowly, the Axis powers began to retreat. Could the Allies win? In the Pacific, the Japanese had been unstoppable. They had captured the Philippines, Hong Kong, and many islands. Their navy seemed invincible. But in June 1942, the U.S. Navy surprised them at the Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers sailed to attack Midway, a small island in the Pacific. They wanted to destroy the U.S. Navy once and for all, but the Americans had cracked the Japanese code. They knew the attack was coming. As the Japanese planes bombed Midway, American planes took off to attack the Japanese ships. The battle in the sky was fierce. Pilots dodged bullets and flew through smoke. Some didn't make it back. By the end of the day, the U.S. Navy had sunk all 4 Japanese carriers. It was a turning point in the Pacific War. Japan's navy was weakened, and they would never recover their strength. The Allies began to push back. In North Africa, German forces, led by General Erwin Rommel, had been winning. Rommel was called the Desert Fox because of his clever strategies. His tanks moved quickly, defeating the Allies again and again. But in October 1942, the Allies made a stand at El Alamein, a small town in Egypt. British General Bernard Montgomery led the charge. He knew that if the Germans captured Egypt, they would control the Suez Canal and valuable oil supplies. The Allies couldn't let that happen. The battle was long and brutal. Soldiers fought in the heat of the desert. Sandstorms blinded them. Bullets and bombs filled the air. But Montgomery's plan worked. The Allies defeated Rommel's forces and pushed them out of Egypt. El Alamein was a major victory. Winston Churchill said, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." The Allies had shown they could win. In the Soviet Union, the German army was still advancing. Hitler believed the Soviets would collapse under the pressure. but the Red Army refused to give up. In the summer of 1942, German forces attacked Stalingrad, an important city on the Volga River. Hitler wanted to capture it to cut off Soviet supplies. The battle for Stalingrad was one of the deadliest in history. The Germans bombed the city from the air. Buildings were reduced to rubble. But the Soviets used the ruins to their advantage. They fought street by street, house by house. Winter arrived, and the temperatures dropped below freezing. The Germans were not prepared for the cold. They ran out of food and supplies. Soviet forces surrounded them, cutting off their escape. In February 1943, the Germans surrendered. Over 90,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. Stalingrad was a turning point in the war. The German army was no longer invincible. The victories at Midway, El Alamein, and Stalingrad gave the Allies hope. But the war was far from over. In the Pacific, the Allies began a strategy called island hopping. They captured one island at a time, moving closer to Japan. Each battle was fierce. Soldiers fought in jungles, on beaches, and in the air. In North Africa, the Allies pushed the Germans back into Tunisia. In May 1943, the remaining Axis forces in Africa surrendered. The Allies now controlled the Mediterranean. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched a massive offensive. They pushed the Germans out of Soviet territory. The tide of the war was turning. But the victories came at a cost. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died. Cities were destroyed. Families were broken. The war was still a long, hard road. In London, people listened to the radio for news. Every victory brought cheers, but they also knew the danger was not over. Bombs still fell. The enemy was still strong. In the U.S., factories worked day and night to produce weapons, tanks, and planes. Soldiers trained for the battles ahead. Families planted victory gardens and rationed food. Everyone worked together to support the war effort. By the end of 1942, the Allies had hope. They had proven they could defeat the Axis powers. The victories gave them strength to keep fighting. But they knew the hardest battles were still to come. Chapter 9. D-Day, the longest day. The night before June 6, 1944, was quiet. Allied soldiers waited nervously on ships. They knew what was coming. They were about to invade Nazi-occupied France. For many, it would be their first battle. For others, it would be their last. The plan was called Operation Overlord, but most people know it as D-Day. It was one of the largest military operations in history. The goal was to free Europe from Nazi control. At midnight, the invasion began. Allied planes flew over Normandy, dropping thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines. These soldiers had a dangerous mission. They had to destroy German defenses and confuse the enemy. The landings on the beaches would follow. But first, the paratroopers faced chaos. Some landed far from their targets. Others were caught by the Germans. Those who survived hid in fields and forests, waiting for their chance to fight. As dawn broke, the sea was full of ships. Over 5,000 vessels carried soldiers, tanks, and supplies toward the beaches. The water was rough, and many soldiers felt seasick. But there was no turning back. The Germans were waiting. They had built strong defenses along the coast. There were mines, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. The beaches were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each one was heavily guarded. The first boats reached the shore. The moment the ramps dropped, German guns opened fire. Soldiers ran into the water, trying to reach the beach. Some were hit before they even stepped onto land. Others crawled through the sand, using anything they could find for cover. Omaha Beach was the bloodiest. The German defenses were strong, and the Allied troops struggled to advance. Private Tom Carter, a young American soldier, clutched his rifle as he ran. Bullets whizzed past him. Explosions shook the ground. Tom dove behind a piece of metal, gasping for breath. Around him, he saw his comrades fighting, shouting, and falling. He knew he had to keep going. Slowly, step by step, the soldiers pushed forward. By the afternoon, the tide began to turn. Reinforcements arrived, and the Allies gained ground. The German defenses started to break. On the other beaches, the story was similar. The Allies faced heavy fire, but kept moving forward. The success of D-Day depended on teamwork. British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces worked together. Sailors guided the ships. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles. Medics risked their lives to save the wounded. One medic, Sarah, was just 22 years old. She had trained for months, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of war. As she ran across the beach, she saw a soldier lying in the sand. His leg was bleeding badly. "Hold on!" she shouted, kneeling beside him. She bandaged his wound as bullets flew overhead. "You're going to be okay," she said, though her hands trembled. Moments later, another medic helped her carry the soldier to safety. By the end of the day, the Allies had secured the beaches. It was a hard-won victory. Over 150,000 soldiers had landed in Normandy. Thousands had died, but the mission was a success. The Allies now had a foothold in France. For the Germans, D-Day was a disaster. They had been caught off guard. Their defenses, once thought to be unbreakable, had failed. D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Over the next weeks, the Allies pushed further into France. They liberated towns and villages. French citizens greeted them with cheers and tears. They waved flags and offered bread and wine. One French girl, Sophie, watched as the soldiers marched through her village. She handed a flower to a young Allied soldier. "Merci," she whispered. It was a small moment, but it meant the world to both of them. D-Day showed the power of courage and determination. Soldiers from different countries came together to fight for freedom. They faced incredible danger, but refused to give up. The road to victory was still long, but for the first time in years, there was hope. The longest day was over. But the fight for Europe had just begun. Chapter 10. The Fall of Berlin. In April 1945, Berlin was a city of chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed in the streets. Smoke rose into the air. Soviet tanks were closing in, and the once powerful Nazi empire was crumbling. The war in Europe had reached its final chapter. Soviet soldiers marched through Germany, capturing town after town. They had fought long and hard to get here. The battles were fierce, and many lives were lost. Now they were at the gates of Berlin. The German army was weak and desperate. Many soldiers were young boys or old men. They fought bravely, but they were no match for the Soviet forces. The city was surrounded. Inside Berlin, life was a nightmare. Buildings were destroyed by bombs. Food was almost gone. People hid in basements, hoping to survive. Families were torn apart. In the heart of the city, Adolf Hitler was hiding in a bunker. It was dark and cold, deep underground. He was surrounded by his closest followers, but even they knew the end was near. Hitler refused to surrender. He still believed in victory, even as his empire collapsed around him. Each day, the Soviet forces moved closer. Tanks rolled through the streets. Soldiers fought, building by building. The fighting was brutal. Grenades exploded. Bullets flew. Civilians ran for cover, their faces filled with fear. A Soviet soldier named Ivan remembered the moment he entered Berlin. "It was like stepping into hell," he said. The city was a pile of rubble. Smoke burned his eyes. But he kept moving forward, determined to end the war. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler's voice went silent. He had taken his own life in the bunker. The Nazi leaders who remained argued about what to do. Some wanted to fight to the death. Others wanted to surrender. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers reached the Reichstag, the German government building. They raised a red flag on its roof, a symbol of victory. Cheers echoed through the streets, but the fighting was not over yet. By May 2nd, Berlin had fallen. German soldiers laid down their weapons. The city was in ruins. People wandered the streets, searching for food, water, or loved ones. The war had left deep scars. On May 7th, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. News spread quickly. In London, Paris, and Moscow, people celebrated. Crowds danced in the streets. Strangers hugged each other. For the first time in years, there was joy. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Millions of people had died. Cities were destroyed. Families were shattered. The survivors carried the weight of the war in their hearts. In Berlin, a young boy named Hans stood among the ruins. His home was gone. His parents were missing. But he found hope in small acts of kindness. A Soviet soldier gave him a piece of bread. A neighbor helped him find shelter. Hans looked up at the sky. It was quiet now, with no planes or bombs. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. The fall of Berlin marked the end of the Nazi regime. The Allies had won. But the world would never be the same. The war in Europe was over. But the scars it left would take generations to heal. Chapter 11. The Bomb That Changed the World. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. But in the Pacific, the fighting continued. Japan refused to surrender. The Allies had tried everything, bombing cities, cutting off supplies, and fighting island by island. Still, Japan fought on. The U.S. had a terrible new weapon. It was called the atomic bomb. It was different from any weapon used before. It could destroy an entire city in seconds. President Harry Truman had to make a decision. Should the U.S. use this weapon? He believed it would end the war quickly and save lives. But the cost would be unimaginable. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a city in Japan. The plane that carried the bomb was called the Enola Gay. Its mission was top secret. The morning was clear and calm. People in Hiroshima were starting their day. Children were on their way to school. Workers were heading to factories. No one knew what was coming. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb exploded. The sky turned into a giant fireball. Buildings collapsed instantly. Thousands of people were killed in seconds. The heat was so intense that shadows were burned onto walls. Those who survived the explosion were badly injured. Many were burned. Others were blinded. The streets were filled with smoke and cries for help. 3 days later, on August 9th, the U.S. dropped a second bomb. This time, it hit Nagasaki. The destruction was just as terrible. More than 70,000 people died in Nagasaki. Many were children, women, and the elderly. Survivors searched for loved ones in the rubble. Some called out names, hoping for an answer. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced more than physical wounds. Many became sick from radiation, a deadly effect of the bomb. The sickness lasted for weeks, months, and even years. Japan could not fight anymore. The Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, made a difficult decision. On August 15, 1945, he announced Japan's surrender. His voice was broadcast on the radio. For many Japanese people, it was the first time they had heard their emperor speak. The war was over. The world celebrated. In New York, London, and Paris, people danced in the streets. They waved flags and hugged strangers. After 6 long years, World War II had finally ended. But in Japan, there was no celebration. The people mourned their dead. Cities were in ruins. Families were broken. The cost of the war was unimaginable. The use of the atomic bomb changed the world forever. It showed the terrible power of science and technology. Countries realized they could destroy each other completely. The fear of nuclear war began. Leaders around the world asked themselves a difficult question. How could they prevent this from happening again? In Hiroshima, a young girl named Aiko survived the bomb. Her family did not. She lived in a shelter for weeks, eating what little food she could find. One day, a kind stranger gave her a piece of rice and a blanket. "You will grow strong again," he said. Aiko grew up and dedicated her life to peace. She told her story to children, hoping they would learn from the past. "War brings only pain," she said. "We must never let this happen again." The bomb had ended the war. but it also left a scar on humanity. The world had changed forever. Chapter 12. Aftermath. A New World. The war was over. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan signed the official surrender. World War II had finally ended. But the world was not the same. The war had left deep scars. Cities were destroyed. Families were broken. Millions of people had died. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children. The survivors carried heavy memories of pain and loss. Yet, from the ruins, the world began to rebuild. In Europe, the damage was immense. Cities like Berlin, London, and Warsaw were in ruins. Buildings were piles of rubble. Streets were empty and silent. Many people had no homes. They searched for food, water, and safety. Refugees wandered the countryside, looking for loved ones. Some never found them. Others started new lives, carrying their grief silently. In Asia, the destruction was just as terrible. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were leveled. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Survivors faced sickness from radiation. The wounds of war were deep, and healing would take time. The human cost of the war was shocking. Over 60 million people had died. This included 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. Nazi concentration camps revealed the horrors of genocide. The world said, never again. But could humanity learn? Leaders of the victorious nations, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and others, met to decide the future. They wanted to ensure that such a war would never happen again. In 1945, the United Nations was born. It was created to promote peace and cooperation between countries. Its mission was clear: solve conflicts through discussion, not war. The first meeting of the United Nations took place in San Francisco. Delegates from many countries gathered. They spoke of hope and unity. They agreed to work together for a better future. The war also changed the balance of power. Two countries emerged as superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. But their relationship was tense. They had different ideas about how the world should be run. The U.S. believed in democracy and free markets. The Soviet Union believed in communism and state control. This tension led to the Cold War, a period of mistrust and competition. At the same time, nations began rebuilding. In Europe, the Marshall Plan helped countries recover. The United States gave billions of dollars to rebuild homes, factories, and roads. It was a symbol of hope. In Japan, American forces helped rebuild the country. General Douglas MacArthur led the efforts. He worked with Japanese leaders to create a new government. The goal was to make Japan a peaceful and democratic nation. But rebuilding was not just about cities and governments. It was also about healing people. In Germany, a young girl named Ingrid returned to her destroyed hometown. Her house was gone. Her school was gone. But Ingrid refused to give up. She joined her neighbors to clear the rubble. They worked together, sharing food and hope. In Japan, a boy named Hiroshi planted seeds in the empty fields near his home. He dreamed of growing enough food to feed his family. Each day, he watered the plants, even when he was tired. His small garden became a symbol of resilience. The war also inspired new ideas. Women who had worked in factories and offices during the war demanded equal rights. In many countries, their role in society began to change. Colonized nations in Asia and Africa saw the war as a turning point. They began to push for independence. Leaders like India's Mahatma Gandhi spoke of freedom and self-rule. The world was entering a new era. Yet, the lessons of the war were not easy to learn. New conflicts arose. The Cold War divided the world into two sides. Countries built powerful weapons, including more nuclear bombs. The fear of another global war haunted everyone. Still, there was hope. Survivors shared their stories so that future generations would understand the cost of war. Memorials were built to honor the dead. Schools taught children about the importance of peace. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It stated that all people deserve freedom, safety, and dignity. It was a small step, but an important one. The world was still fragile. But humanity had a chance to start again. The aftermath of World War II was a time of both pain and possibility. The scars of war were deep, but so was the desire for peace. The question remained, would the lessons of the past shape a better future?